My daughter pushed me onto the subway tracks. But I survived and turned his life into a nightmare. Just 4 days after his wife's funeral, Frank was in the heartbreaking silence of his Park Slope home when the doorbell rang. It was his son, Leo, but he wasn't alone. "Leo, I'm here," Frank cheered, his voice cracking. "Dad, this is Mr. Jacobson," Leo interrupted, his voice as cold as a stranger's. "An appraiser? An appraiser? For what?" Frank was confused. Leo brushed past his father and headed straight for the bedroom, where all his mother's mementos were still intact. He pulled out her jewelry drawer. "To get a valuation of some things," he said without turning around. "I need to know what they're worth." Frank was stunned. "Leo, those are your mother's." Leo finally turned around, his gaze eerily flat. "We can't just let it sit in a drawer and collect dust, can we, Dad? It's an asset. We better understand its liquidity. I guess 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you? And where are you listening?" The silence was the first thing Frank noticed. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a hungry, hollow thing that had moved into the Park Slope brownstone the day after the funeral and consumed every familiar sound. It ate the echo of Sarah's laughter in the hallway, the soft click of her knitting needles in the evening, the cheerful hum of the coffee grinder in the morning. Now, the grand old house was just a container for quiet. Afternoon sunlight, thick with swirling dust motes Frank never used to see, streamed through the tall parlor windows. It illuminated the polished oak floors and the carefully chosen mid-century modern furniture that was Sarah's pride and joy. One, two, she had an artist's eye for it, curating their life with pieces that were both beautiful and lived in. The gentle curve of the Ames lounge chair where she read, the sleek lines of the Danish teak sideboard that held their wedding china. 3, 4, 5, Frank ran a hand over its smooth surface, half expecting to feel the warmth of her touch lingering there. He could still smell her, faintly, on the cashmere scarf draped over the back of a chair, a scent of lavender, and something uniquely Sarah that made his throat tighten. He found himself tending to her plants, a ritual he'd inherited by default. A row of orchids, fussy and delicate, lined the bay window. Sarah had called them her divas, and Frank now misted their leaves with a devotion that felt like prayer. He was keeping something of her alive, something beyond the crushing weight of memory. He adjusted a pot, his fingers brushing against a wilting leaf. Grief, he was discovering, was a lot like this. You went through the motions of care, hoping something, anything, would bloom again. The emptiness began to feel like a physical presence, pressing in on him. He needed to hear a voice. Not just any voice. He needed Leo. He picked up his phone, the cool, solid weight of it, a stark contrast to the trembling in his hand. He scrolled to his son's name, the photo beside it, a relic from 5 years ago, Leo, grinning, arms slung around his mother's shoulders on a trip to Montauk. They were so happy. Frank's thumb hovered over the call button, a flicker of hope warring with a creeping dread he couldn't name. He pressed it. It rang once, twice, 3 times, each ring echoing in the cavernous silence of the living room. Then voicemail, of course. Frank cleared his throat, trying to inject a warmth he didn't feel into his voice. "Leo, it's Dad. Just wanted to check in," he began, his words sounding clumsy and loud. "You know, this house feels kind of empty." He paused, staring at the Noguchi coffee table, another of Sarah's finds, its glass top reflecting the lonely room. 3, 6. Maybe we should go to lunch at that Peter Luger steakhouse you like this weekend. The name, a New York institution, felt solid, a piece of their shared history. 7-8, a place of masculine tradition, of big stakes and bigger conversations. A place where fathers and sons were supposed to connect. He ended the message, feeling foolish and exposed. 2 hours passed. 2 hours in which Frank tidied already tidy surfaces, stared out the window at the passing Brooklyn traffic, and replayed the voicemail in his head, dissecting every pathetic syllable. He was just about to convince himself that Leo was simply tied up in a meeting, that work was his son's way of coping, when his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He snatched it up, his heart giving a hopeful little lurch. A text message. "Leo, busy this week, Dad. Talk later." That was it. Frank read the words again and again. The font was clean, impersonal, busy. The word was a shield, a corporate jargon wall built to keep emotion out. Talk later. A dismissal, not a promise. There was no love you, no thinking of you, not even a sorry. For a grieving father reaching out from the wreckage of his life, the indifference was a physical blow, more painful than any angry outburst could have been. It was the first crack in the carefully constructed image Frank held of his son. He put the phone down and stared out the window for a long, long time. Why hadn't he noticed this change sooner? He tried to reason with himself to smooth over the sharp edges of his hurt. He's trying to be strong for me, Frank thought, the justification flimsy even to his own ears. He's throwing himself into work to forget the pain. That's how this generation copes with loss. They compartmentalize. This self-deception was a small, sad comfort, making his own loneliness feel more tragic, more real. The coldness of the screen in his hand triggered a memory, vivid and warm from a lifetime ago. Leo, maybe 6 years old, his small face streaked with tears and dirt. He'd taken a tumble off his bike, a spectacular wipeout on the sidewalk right outside this very house. His knee was a mess of blood and gravel. Frank had scooped him up, his heart aching with that fierce, primal love only a parent knows. Leo had wrapped his skinny arms around Frank's neck, burying his face in his shoulder, his sobs shaking his small body. He'd clung to him, seeking comfort and safety, and Frank had held him tight, whispering, "I've got you. Daddy's got you." Frank closed his eyes. The memory, so sweet and pure, was now laced with a bitter poison. Where had that boy gone? The boy who clung to him for comfort was now a man who kept him at arm's length with a 5-word text message. The pure, uncomplicated grief over losing his wife was now tainted by something else, a nagging, insidious worry. He was no longer just mourning Sarah. He was beginning to wonder if he had lost his son, too. He walked back into the living room and picked up a framed photo from the mantelpiece. Sarah and Leo on that same Montauk trip. Her head was thrown back in laughter. His arm was wrapped protectively around her. Frank looked at his son's face in the picture, searching for a clue, an answer. But there was nothing, only a smiling stranger. Why was Leo so cold? Was it just work? Just his way of dealing with the pain? Or was there another reason, something hidden in the shadows of their shared loss? What had their relationship, mother and son, truly been like before she was gone? Frank didn't know, and as the silence in the big house settled around him once more, the uncertainty felt heavier than the grief itself. For 3 days, the silence in the brownstone was Frank's only companion. He had learned its rhythms, its textures. He had started to accept it. Then, on the 4th day, the doorbell rang. The sound was a violent intrusion, a jolt to the heart of the house. Frank froze, a half-dusted photograph of Sarah in his hand. Who would be calling? Not a condolence visit, surely. Those had trickled to a stop. A delivery? He walked to the door, a flicker of absurd hope lighting in his chest. Maybe it was Leo. Maybe he'd felt guilty about the text and had come to talk, to take him to Peter Luger's after all. He swung the heavy oak door open, and for a breathtaking second his hope was realized. It was Leo. But the joy died on his lips, extinguished as his eyes took in the second figure standing on the stoop, a man older than Leo, with silver hair and a somber suit, carrying a slim leather briefcase. He looked like an undertaker, or a lawyer. "Leo," Frank said, his voice a mixture of surprise and confusion. "You came without notice. Who is this?" Leo didn't meet his eyes. He was dressed in a sleek, dark suit that looked more appropriate for a Wall Street boardroom than his childhood home. He hadn't even bothered to loosen his tie. He stepped inside, his expensive leather shoes clicking on the polished floorboards without any thought of removing them. The stranger followed. "Dad, this is Mr. Jacobson," Leo said, his tone clipped and businesslike, gesturing vaguely toward the man. "An expert in antiques and jewelry." Frank's mind snagged on the words. "Expert? For what?" He looked from his son's impassive face to the expert's neutral one, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. Leo didn't answer. He moved past Frank with an unnerving sense of purpose, heading directly for the staircase. He was a stranger navigating a familiar map, his movements precise and devoid of nostalgia. Frank and Mr. Jacobson followed in his wake, a bizarre and silent procession up the carpeted stairs, past the gallery of family photos that Leo didn't even glance at. He led them straight into the master bedroom. It was Sarah's sanctuary, Frank's sanctuary, the one room that still felt wholly hers, flooded with afternoon light from the windows overlooking the garden she had so lovingly tended. On the walnut dressing table, her silver-backed brush lay next to her favorite compact and the iconic square bottle of Chanel No. 5 perfume. The air still held the ghost of its scent. It was a sacred space. And Leo had just invaded it. He walked directly to the dressing table, his reflection appearing momentarily in the mirror, a cool, detached stranger. With a swift, decisive movement, he pulled open the top drawer, the one where Sarah kept her jewelry. The sound was a desecration. "To price a few things," Leo said finally, answering Frank's earlier question without turning around. "I need to know their real value." Frank stared, his brain refusing to process the scene. Shock, cold and sharp, pierced through his grief. "Mr. Jacobson set his briefcase down, opened it, and produced a pair of soft, white gloves, which he put on with methodical care. He then took out a jeweler's loupe and a small set of tongs. "Leo, what are you doing?" Frank's voice was barely a whisper. Leo ignored him. He gestured toward the open drawer. "Let's start with the pearls, Mr. Jacobson." The expert reached into the drawer with his tongs and lifted out the pearl necklace Frank had given Sarah for their 25th anniversary. He held it up to the light, the pearls glowing with a soft luster, imbued with the memory of 100 happy evenings. "A classic Akoya strand," Mr. Jacobson murmured, his voice professionally muted. He examined the clasp with his loupe. "The clasp is 18-karat gold. Depending on the uniformity and nacre thickness, the current market value would be—" Frank didn't hear the number. He saw Leo, standing with his arms crossed, his posture upright and confident, watching the proceedings with an unnerving calm. He wasn't looking at his mother's necklace. He was looking at a financial asset. His gaze was the same one he probably used to assess stock charts and market fluctuations. Cold, pragmatic, utterly devoid of emotion. Frank, by contrast, felt himself hunching, shrinking. He took a step forward, his hand raised as if to ward off a blow. "Leo, stop. This is your mother's stuff. We can't—" Leo finally turned to him, his eyes flat. "We can't what, Dad? Let it sit in a drawer and collect dust? It's an asset, a significant one. It's better to understand its liquidity." Liquidity. The word hung in the sacred air of the bedroom, obscene and alien. He wasn't mourning, he was liquidating. The terrifying realization crashed down on Frank, with the force of a physical impact. The cold texts, the distance, it wasn't a young man's clumsy way of handling grief. It was the complete and utter absence of it. The anxiety he'd felt before was a pale, flimsy thing compared to the horror that was now crystallizing in his heart. His son's problem wasn't a flawed coping mechanism. It was a fundamental lack of morality, a hole where a heart should be. Mr. Jacobson, oblivious, had moved on, his gloved hands now hovering over the sapphire earrings Frank had bought Sarah the day they brought Leo home from the hospital. "And these are lovely," the expert said. "The carat weight on the stones looks impressive." Frank looked at his son, truly looked at him, and saw a stranger wearing his child's face. The grief for his wife was still a raw, open wound, but a new, sharper pain was tearing through him, the understanding that he was now, in every sense of the word, completely and utterly alone. The sight of Mr. Jacobson's tongs hovering over Sarah's sapphire earrings snapped something in Frank. The fog of grief was burned away by a sudden searing heat. "Get out," he said. The voice was his, but it was a voice he hadn't used in years. The voice of an architect commanding a construction site. A voice that did not brook argument. Leo and the expert both turned. Mr. Jacobson looked startled, his gloved hand frozen midair. Leo's expression was one of mild annoyance, as if Frank were a troublesome child acting out. "Dad, calm down. We're almost finished here." "I said, get out," Frank repeated, stepping between Leo and the dressing table. He was protecting it, protecting her. "Both of you. Now." He walked out of the bedroom and down the stairs, not waiting to see if they followed. He went straight to his study. It was his sanctuary, a room paneled in rich cherry wood, lined with leather-bound books on architecture and philosophy. The walls were covered with his own framed, hand-drawn renderings of buildings that now stood tall across the city. It was a room built on logic, order, and integrity. He stood behind his large mahogany desk, the solid wood a ballast in the storm that had just ripped through his home. Leo appeared in the doorway a moment later, Mr. Jacobson hovering nervously behind him in the hall. "I've asked Mr. Jacobson to wait in the car," Leo said, his tone suggesting a great and magnanimous patience. "Now, what is this about?" Frank's voice was firm, steely. "Leo, stop right there. Your mother's will clearly states that all her personal jewelry is a keepsake, not to be sold. It belongs to the family." He remembered the meeting with the lawyer clearly, one of the few sharp memories from that blurry, awful week. A smile touched Leo's lips. It was a smirk, really a thin, bloodless curve that Frank had never seen on his son's face before. It was the smile of a predator. "You're wrong, Dad," Leo said, stepping into the study, invading this space too. "I talked to the lawyer. Mom left all assets to you, on the condition that you are allowed to live here until you no longer need it." He paused, letting the cruel euphemism hang in the air. "Legally, this is my house now. And so are these," he said, gesturing back up the stairs toward the bedroom by extension. The lie was so audacious, so monstrous, that Frank felt the air leave his lungs. It was a direct assault on his ownership, his security, his memory of his wife's wishes, all delivered within the heart of his own power. He stared at his son, trying to reconcile the smiling boy from the photographs with this cold, calculating stranger. "That's not true," Frank managed, but the words felt weak, uncertain. Had he misremembered? Was his grief-addled mind playing tricks on him? "Check with the lawyer if you don't believe me," Leo said with a confident shrug. "Now, I'll be back next week to finish the appraisal. I suggest you don't make things difficult." He turned and walked out, leaving Frank standing alone in the sudden, ringing silence of his study. For a full minute, Frank didn't move. He felt the foundations of his world cracking beneath his feet. Could Leo be right? The days after Sarah's death were a painful blur of faces, casseroles, and paperwork. He stumbled to his filing cabinet, his hands trembling. He pulled open the drawer marked "Personal," his fingers fumbling through files. Mortgages, insurance policies, car titles. Where was it? Panic began to set in, a chaotic whirlwind in his usually ordered mind. He couldn't find the copy of the will. Everything was a mess. He sank into his leather chair, his head in his hands. Leo was counting on this. He was counting on his father's grief, on his confusion, on his love, that fundamental paternal instinct that would make him want to avoid a fight, to believe, against all evidence, in the goodness of his own son. Then, through the chaos, a name surfaced. David Chen, their family lawyer for 30 years, a man of quiet integrity, a man Sarah had trusted implicitly. Frank's hand was steady now as he picked up the phone and dialed. "Frank, good to hear from you, though I wish it were under better circumstances," David's calm voice said. "David, I have a question about Sarah's will," Frank said, cutting straight to the point. "A question about the house and the jewelry." "Of course," David said. "It's all very straightforward. As we discussed, Sarah's will specifies that you are the sole beneficiary of the estate. The house, all financial accounts, her personal effects, it all passes to you, Frank. Unconditionally." Frank closed his eyes, a wave of cold relief washing over him. He wasn't crazy. And Leo? Leo is the beneficiary of a trust fund, to be dispersed to him upon his 40th birthday. Sarah was specific about that. The trust fund, the turning point, the undeniable proof. Frank wasn't misremembering. His son had stood in this very room and constructed an elaborate, cruel fraud. The story wasn't a family tragedy anymore. It was a conspiracy. As Frank thanked David and hung up the phone, another memory, sharp and unwelcome, surfaced. It was from a few months before Sarah got sick. They were sitting in the garden and she was quiet, a worried line between her brows. "I worry about Leo, Frank," she'd said, staring at her roses. "The pressure he's under on Wall Street, the things he talks about, the money, it's changing him." Frank had dismissed it. "It's a tough world, Sarah. He's a smart kid. He can handle it." Oh, how wrong he'd been. Sarah had seen it. She had seen the rot setting in and had taken legal steps to protect the family, to protect Leo from himself. Leo's lie wasn't just an attack on Frank. It was a desecration of his mother's final, loving act of foresight. The profound pain in Frank's chest was replaced by something new, something hard and cold and clear. Anger. Not the hot, explosive anger of a shouting match, but a cold, calculating fury. He had been deceived, yes, but more than that. His son had dared to twist Sarah's intelligence and her love into a weapon against him. This was no longer about a grieving father and a distant son. This was a battle to defend the honor of his dead wife, and it was a battle Frank had no intention of losing. In the week that followed, Frank played the part of the defeated man. When Leo called, his voice laced with a synthetic, cloying concern, Frank was quiet, monosyllabic. He allowed his son's narrative to take hold the story of a grieving, confused old man who couldn't be trusted to remember the details of his own life. He saw the flicker of triumph in Leo's eyes during a brief, perfunctory visit. Leo thought he had won. Frank let him. He knew that to trap a predator, you must first make it feel safe. He waited. He listened. And on Thursday afternoon, he put his plan into motion. He told Leo he would be spending the day in the city with an old colleague, that he wouldn't be back until late. Then he simply went to the local library for a few hours before walking home, deliberately 2 hours earlier than he had promised. He knew something was wrong the moment he saw the cars parked on his street, a black Mercedes, a sleek Tesla, cars that didn't belong to his neighbors. He let himself in with his key, the familiar click of the lock lost in the low murmur of voices coming from the living room. His living room, Sarah's living room. It was unrecognizable. The warm, inviting space where they had hosted countless intimate dinner parties and family Christmases had been transformed into a cold, commercial showroom. The lamps were angled down like spotlights. On the Eames coffee table, where Sarah's art books should have been, lay squares of black velvet, and on the velvet, glittering under the focused light, lay his wife's jewelry. Her pearls, her sapphires, her diamond earrings. They were laid out like specimens, tagged and numbered. Leo stood at the center of it all, a glass of champagne in hand, playing the role of the charming host. He was surrounded by a small group of exquisitely dressed people, men in bespoke suits, and women dripping with a casual, expensive elegance. Frank's home had been turned into a stage, and his son was the star performer. A woman in a Chanel suit, her face a mask of practiced indifference, leaned in to examine a necklace. "This Cartier piece is exquisite, Leo," she said, her voice carrying across the hushed room. "Are you sure of its provenance?" Leo laughed, a smooth, polished sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Absolutely, Mrs. Astor. This was my mother's collection. She had wonderful taste." The lie, so casual, so public, was the final insult. Frank stepped out of the shadows of the hallway and into the light. The murmur of conversation faltered and died as all eyes turned to him. He was no longer the hunched, grieving man. He stood tall, his presence filling the space in a way that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with authority. He was the master of this house. His eyes locked on Leo, whose charming smile had frozen on his face. Frank's voice, when he spoke, was cold as ice, cutting through the strained silence. She also had a wonderful will. He let the words land, letting the implications sink into the thick, expensive air. He saw the flicker of confusion, then dawning suspicion, on the faces of the guests. "And there's nothing in it," Frank continued, his gaze unwavering, "that says her personal belongings are to be auctioned off in my living room." The public humiliation was a palpable thing. Mrs. Astor took a half step back from the coffee table as if the jewelry were now radioactive. A man cleared his throat, suddenly finding the pattern of the Persian rug fascinating. Leo's face, which had been pale, was now flushed with a dark, furious red. He was exposed, his carefully constructed performance shattered. Frank turned his attention to the guests. "I'm Frank Morrison," he said, his tone polite but firm. "This is my home. This viewing is over. I must ask you all to leave." There was no argument. No one wanted to be caught in the crossfire of this ugly family war. There were quiet apologies, averted eyes, and a swift, awkward exodus. Within 2 minutes, the living room was empty, save for the father and the son. The silence that descended was heavier, more dangerous than any that had come before. The jewelry still glittered on the velvet, a treasure trove of lies. Leo finally moved, placing his champagne flute down with a sharp click. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he hissed, the charm gone, replaced by pure venom. Frank didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He walked over to his desk by the window and picked up a single sheet of paper. I'm doing what your mother would have wanted, Leo. I spoke to David Chen. He saw the flicker in Leo's eyes, not surprise, but the cold, hard glint of being caught. I know about the will, Leo. The real one, Frank said calmly. I know about the trust. I know that everything in this house, including every last piece of jewelry on that table, belongs to me, unconditionally. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing register. So this is my final warning. You will not bring strangers into this house again. You will not touch another thing that belonged to your mother. This little performance is over. If you try anything like this again, if you so much as mention the will or this house to anyone, I will not hesitate to involve the authorities. And we both know how a fraud investigation would look for a man in your line of work. He was no longer a victim. He was a guardian. In his cold anger, he had found a strength he thought he had lost forever. He was no longer just fighting for a house or for jewelry. He was fighting for the truth of the woman he had loved, and he would not let her memory be sold to the highest bidder. The silence that followed the expulsion of Leo's wealthy clientele was different. It was no longer the hollow, hungry silence of grief, nor the tense, waiting silence of a cold war. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the first, shocking volley, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the certainty of more conflict to come. Frank felt no triumph, only a grim, weary clarity. He had drawn his line in the sand. Now he waited to see if his son would dare to cross it. He didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was a single, imperious jab, unlike the cheerful chime of a neighbor or the rat-a-tat of a deliveryman. Frank was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, a simple, domestic act that felt like an anchor in the churning sea of his life. He walked to the front of the house, his steps measured, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He knew who it was. He opened the heavy oak door. Leo stood on the stoop, not on the welcome mat. He was dressed again in his Wall Street armor, a dark suit, and a face scrubbed of all emotion. He did not ask to come in. He did not look his father in the eye. He simply held out a thick manila envelope. Like I said, this house is mine, Leo said, his tone as cold and formal as a legal filing. He thrust the envelope at Frank. This is an official notice. You have 30 days. My lawyer will be in contact with yours. Frank took the papers, the weight of them feeling obscene in his hand. He didn't look at them. He looked at his son, searching for some flicker of the boy he had raised, some hint of doubt or pain. He found nothing, only a chilling, vacant resolve. Leo, have you really gone this far? Frank's voice was low, stripped of the anger from their last encounter, leaving only a raw, desolate disbelief. Are you trying to kick me out of the house I built with your mother, the home you grew up in? For the first time, Leo met his gaze. He offered a small, cruel shrug, a gesture of such profound indifference it was more violent than a physical blow. That's not my business, he said. It's the law. It's just business, Dad. It's just business. The phrase, a mantra for men like his son, was used here to justify the ultimate act of personal betrayal. It was the moment Frank's last, stubborn hope died. He had hoped for remorse, for a retreat, for some sign that the son he loved was still in there somewhere, trapped beneath this cold, grasping shell. But the shrug, the empty words, told him the truth. His son was gone. The person standing before him was a hostile stranger. Frank said nothing more. He simply closed the door, the solid click of the lock echoing the final, definitive closing of a door in his heart. He leaned his back against the cool wood, the sounds of the Brooklyn street outside a passing car, the laughter of children seeming to come from another world. He looked down at the sheaf of papers in his hand. It was an eviction notice, filled with clumsy, threatening legal jargon that was clearly downloaded from the internet and not drafted by any legitimate lawyer. A forgery. A pathetic, desperate, and deeply cruel escalation. This was the moment of the break. All the love, the shared memories, the decades of paternal pride and affection, they curdled and dissolved into a kind of grim pity. The pain was immense, but it was a clean, surgical pain, the amputation of a gangrenous limb. The love he had for Leo, the unconditional, foundational love of a father, was dead. It had been murdered on this doorstep. He walked, not with the aimless shuffle of a grieving man, but with the steady, purposeful stride of someone with a job to do. He passed the living room, where the ghosts of Sarah's laughter still lingered. He passed the staircase, where a 6-year-old boy had once clung to him for comfort. These memories no longer caused him pain. They were simply artifacts from a life that no longer existed, relics of a child who was gone. He entered his study, his sanctuary of logic and order. He placed the fraudulent eviction notice on the polished surface of his mahogany desk. He looked at it, this flimsy piece of paper that was meant to terrorize him, to break him, to drive him from his own life. He thought of Leo's cold eyes, his dismissive shrug. He thought of Sarah, of her foresight, of her fierce, protective love that had reached beyond the grave to try and save them both. He had tried to honor her with patience, with reason, with a private confrontation, but he saw now that he had been wrong. You do not reason with a home invader. You do not negotiate with a thief. You call the police. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Frank's lips. It was not a smile of happiness or of humor. It was a smile of absolute chilling certainty. The agonizing emotional calculus was over. The path forward was now a straight, clean line. He was no longer torn. He had reached a state of serenity in his decision. He was no longer a father protecting a wayward son. He was a citizen reporting a crime. He was doing what needed to be done to restore order and justice to the world Sarah had left in his care. He picked up the phone, the receiver cool and solid in his steady hand. He dialed 3 numbers. A calm, professional voice answered. 911. What's your emergency? Frank's voice was perfectly level, clear and distinct, without a tremor of hesitation. It was the voice of a man reporting a mechanical failure, not the voice of a man about to have his only son arrested. Hello, he said. I'd like to report a series of crimes. Okay, sir. What's the address? He gave it. And what is the nature of the emergency? My son is on my property, Frank stated, his tone matter-of-fact. He has been attempting to sell stolen property, specifically my deceased wife's jewelry, which is legally mine. He has just threatened me and served me with fraudulent legal documents in an attempt to illegally evict me from my home. He paused, letting the operator process the information. He could already hear it. A faint sound in the far distance. A familiar urban cry that was, for the first time in his life, a sound of comfort. The sound of order on its way to confront chaos. Sir, are you in immediate danger? The operator asked. Not anymore, Frank said, the small, cold smile still on his lips as the sound of sirens grew steadily, relentlessly, closer. Help is on the way! The arrival of the NYPD was a shockingly swift and quiet affair. There was no Hollywood drama, no shouting, just 2 patrol cars gliding to a stop at the curb, their flashing lights painting the respectable brownstone facades in frantic strokes of red and blue. Frank stood in his doorway, a silent, impassive sentinel. He watched as 2 officers approached Leo, who was still fuming on the sidewalk, the forged eviction notice clutched in his hand. From across the street, curtains twitched. Frank could feel the eyes of his neighbors, the quiet arbiters of Park Slope propriety, peering out into the twilight. This was the kind of spectacle that didn't happen here, on their tree-lined 7-figure block. This was a messy public unraveling, an unwelcome intrusion of harsh reality into their curated world. He watched as Leo, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage, was calmly, professionally handcuffed. The expensive fabric of his business suit bunched at the shoulders as his hands were secured behind his back. He didn't struggle. He didn't shout. He just stared at the oak door of the house, at the father who stood there, his expression unreadable. Frank did not look at his son. He looked past him, at the flashing lights, at the gathering darkness. He had made a call, and this was the response. It was as simple and as terrible as that. The next morning, the judgment began. Frank went out to retrieve his copy of the New York Times from the stoop, a ritual of normalcy in a world that had become anything but. That's when he saw Eleanor Henderson from across the street, immaculate in her black Lululemon workout gear, her golden retriever pulling eagerly at its leash. Usually, she would offer a bright, toothy smile and a wave. Today, she stopped at a safe, calculated distance. Frank, she began, her tone a careful blend of pity and morbid curiosity. I heard the news. What a tragedy. If you need anything at all. Her voice trailed off, the offer hanging empty in the crisp morning air. Thank you, Eleanor. Everything is under control, Frank replied, his own voice calm, sensing the intense scrutiny behind her sympathetic facade. She took a step closer, lowering her voice as if sharing a state secret. It's just the police, right on our street. The kids saw it all from their windows. Everyone's worried. There it was. Everyone's worried. It wasn't a statement of concern for him, for the man whose life had been torn apart first by grief and now by betrayal. It was a subtle rebuke. His private tragedy had become a public nuisance, shattering the placid, high property value peace of the neighborhood. He was no longer just Frank, the quiet architect, the grieving widower. He was now the man whose son got arrested on the front lawn. He had become gossip. I'm sure they'll recover, Frank said, before turning and walking back inside, the weight of their collective judgment a tangible thing on his shoulders. He realized then that personal justice came at a social cost. He did not care. Later that day, he sat in David Chen's quiet, book-lined office. The lawyer looked tired. They're charging him with grand larceny for the attempted sale of the jewelry. Its value puts it well into felony territory, David explained, ticking points off on a legal pad, plus forgery for the eviction notice, and harassment. His lawyer called me this morning. They're going to paint a picture, Frank. A grieving, unstable father lashing out at his only son. It's going to be a costly and a dirty fight. Frank just nodded. Do what you have to do, David. His resolve hadn't wavered. If anything, the neighborhood's whispers and the threat of a legal battle only hardened it. That evening, a strange compulsion took hold of him. He needed to reclaim his house, to purge the lingering presence of the stranger his son had become. He started with Leo's childhood bedroom. It had become a guest room, really, a place Leo used on the rare occasions he stayed over. It was neat, impersonal, except for a few relics on the bookshelf, a dusty baseball trophy, a worn copy of The Catcher in the Rye. Frank began to clear things out, boxing up old books, preparing to repaint, to erase. As he moved the old wooden bed frame away from the wall, his foot caught on a loose floorboard near the corner. He'd meant to fix it for years. He knelt, his fingers finding the edge and prying it up. He expected to find nothing but dust and century-old insulation. Instead, he found a small hidden cavity, and inside that cavity was a stack of envelopes held together by a thick rubber band. His heart gave a slow, heavy thud. These weren't childhood report cards or forgotten letters. The envelopes were thick, formal, with return addresses he didn't recognize. He pulled them out. The top one was from a company called Blackwood Capital Partners, a name that sounded both prestigious and predatory. He opened it. It was a debt collection letter, the language aggressive, demanding immediate payment on a loan of a staggering amount. The interest rate listed beside it was nothing short of usurious. It was a private lender, a loan shark in a suit. He thumbed through the rest. There were more letters from Blackwood, each more threatening than the last. And beneath them, something else. Official-looking notices from the Borgata Hotel Casino and Spa in Atlantic City. They weren't letters of congratulation. They were statements of losses, markers called in, notifications of revoked credit lines. Frank sat back on his heels, the papers spread out on the floor around him. The air in the small room felt thick, heavy. This was the turning point. The key. It wasn't just greed that had driven Leo to violate his mother's memory and threaten his own father. It was desperation. He was cornered, drowning in gambling debts, and he had looked at his mother's legacy not as a memory to be cherished, but as a lifeline to be cashed in. The villain of his story had just become more complex, more pathetic, and somehow more dangerous. The cold anger Frank had felt was now being replaced by something else, something colder still, curiosity. His initial desire for justice, for a reckoning, was morphing. He no longer wanted to simply punish Leo. He wanted to understand. How deep did this go? How far had his son fallen? He was no longer just the victim. He was now the investigator, and he had just found the first piece of a puzzle far darker than he could have ever imagined. I guess 99% of you will hear this. Sigh and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe, even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you? And where are you listening? The decision to drive to Atlantic City was not an emotional one, it was logistical. The letters were the coordinates on a map, and Frank, a man who had spent his life reading blueprints, knew he had to follow them to understand the structure of his son's collapse. The drive itself was a study in contrasts. He left the stately, tree-lined quiet of Park Slope, crossing the Verrazano Narrows Bridge and watching the familiar, soaring skyline of Manhattan recede in his rearview mirror. He drove south through the flat, unremarkable landscape of the New Jersey Turnpike, a monotonous stretch of concrete and commerce. Then, as he neared his destination, the world began to change. The sky, even in the daytime, seemed to acquire a strange artificial glow. Gaudy, fantastical structures rose from the flat marshlands, a faux Roman palace, a shimmering glass tower, a caricature of a Moroccan Kasbah. It was an architecture of desperation, a city built on bad bets and fleeting hope. To Frank, whose aesthetic was rooted in the clean lines of modernism and the enduring solidity of brownstone, it was all profoundly alien. It was Leo's world. He pulled up to the Borgata, a sleek, imposing tower of dark glass that seemed to absorb the afternoon light without reflection. Inside, the world dissolved into a perpetual twilight, a sensory assault of flashing lights, the ceaseless, chaotic symphony of slot machines paying out and being fed, and the low, anxious hum of 1,000 private prayers being offered up to the goddess of chance. The air was stale, tasting of cigarettes, perfume, and something metallic that Frank decided was disappointment. He bypassed the gaming floor, his eyes fixed on the signs for the administrative offices. He was not here to gawk or to judge. He was here to gather information. He had called ahead using a pretense of being a family financial advisor, trying to sort out a client's affairs. He had a name, Sal, a floor manager mentioned in one of the notices. He was led to a plush, windowless office deep in the casino's underbelly. Sal was a man in his 50s, wearing an impeccably tailored suit that couldn't quite hide the weariness in his eyes. He looked like a man who had seen every possible permutation of human hope and despair. "Mr. Miller," Sal said, gesturing to a leather chair. "Thanks for coming in. You said on the phone this was about Leo Morrison, Frank Saturday." He didn't waste time with pleasantries or appeals to sympathy. He reached into his jacket pocket and slid a thick, plain white envelope across the polished desk. "For your time and discretion," Frank said. "A consulting fee." "Oh." Sal's professional mask didn't slip, but his eyes flickered down to the envelope for a fraction of a second before he slid it into a desk drawer. The transaction was complete. This was a world where information had a price, and Frank was willing to pay it. "I'm just trying to understand," Frank began, his voice even. "My client, he's found himself in some trouble. I'm trying to get a clear picture of his liabilities. Does he come here often?" Sal sighed, a long, tired exhalation, as he turned to his computer and typed. A file appeared on the screen. "Mr. Morrison," he said, the honorific dripping with irony. "Yeah, we know him. Your client is what we in the industry call a baby whale. Comes in with a big bankroll, plays fast and heavy, and almost always leaves it with us. Likes the high-limit baccarat tables." He scrolled down the screen. "Let's see. In the last 6 months, he's made 8 trips. His net loss is significant." He didn't say the number, but the slight raise of his eyebrows told Frank everything he needed to know. "The last time he was here," Sal continued, his voice dropping slightly, "was about a month ago. He lost a 6-figure sum in under 2 hours at the baccarat table. Wiped him out." Sal hesitated, then seemed to decide the consulting fee had paid for the whole story. "Then he made a scene. He accused the dealer of cheating, then threw a full glass of Macallan 18 at a cocktail waitress who asked if he wanted another. We had to escort him from the premises. He has a lifetime ban." Frank sat perfectly still, absorbing the ugly tableau. It wasn't just greed. It was arrogance, addiction, and a frightening, violent entitlement. This was the son he had raised. The polite boy who held doors open for strangers. This was the man he had become when no one was watching. "When a player like that gets wiped out," Frank said, his voice now cold clinical, "and his credit line with the house is cut, where does he go if he wants to keep playing?" Sal gave him a knowing look. "A guy like that gets desperate. We don't officially endorse anything, of course, but our hosts might quietly suggest a few private capital firms that are accommodating, for a price." He typed something else into a search bar. He asked about a company called Blackwood Capital Partners. "Oh?" The name landed with the force of a physical blow. The same name from the letters under the floorboard. The chain was now complete. The gambling, the catastrophic losses, the violent outburst, and the desperate flight into the arms of a loan shark. He had it all. Frank stood up. "Thank you for your time, Sal. You've been very helpful." He walked out of the office, through the maze of corridors, and back onto the dizzying casino floor. The noise, the lights, the desperate energy of the crowd, it all seemed to wash over him without effect. He no longer felt the alienation or disgust of an outsider. He felt only a cold, crystalline clarity. He pushed through the main doors and stepped out onto the boardwalk. The salty air was a shock to his lungs after the canned atmosphere inside. The sun was beginning to set over the Atlantic, casting a long golden light across the waves. The sound of the ocean was real, constant, a powerful rhythm against the artificial pulse of the city behind him. He looked out at the vast, indifferent horizon. The last vestiges of grief for the son he thought he had were gone, washed away by the tide. He was not a father mourning a lost child. He was an architect who had just discovered a fatal structural flaw in his most important creation, and he had in his possession the blueprint that proved it. He had the motive, he had the evidence, he had the trump card, and he knew exactly how he was going to play it. The journey to the Brooklyn detention complex was a journey into another world. Frank navigated layers of security, each one colder and more impersonal than the last. He emptied his pockets into a gray plastic tray, walked through a metal detector, and presented his ID to a guard behind thick plexiglass. The air was sterile, smelling of disinfectant and a faint, underlying human misery. There was no polished oak or warm sunlight here, only painted cinder-block walls, scuffed linoleum floors, and the harsh buzzing glare of fluorescent lights. This was a place stripped of all pretense, a place of pure, hard consequence. Frank felt no intimidation, only a grim sense of purpose. He was an architect entering a building of someone else's design, here to inspect the catastrophic structural failure of his own son. He was led to a small cubicle in the visitation room. A stainless steel stool was bolted to the floor in front of a thick glass partition, bisected by a steel mesh speaker. He sat and waited. A door buzzed open on the other side, and Leo was led in by a guard. The sight of him was a jolt, a flash of pity that Frank immediately suppressed. Gone was the bespoke suit, the confident stride, the air of Wall Street invincibility. He was dressed in a standard issue, faded navy blue jumpsuit, 2 sizes too big, which seemed to swallow his frame. His face was pale, his hair was unkempt, and the arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by a sullen, resentful scowl. He looked diminished, ordinary. He looked like a prisoner. Leo slumped onto the stool opposite Frank and picked up the black telephone receiver. Frank picked up his. For a long moment, they just looked at each other through the smudged, thick glass, 2 men separated by a world of bad choices. It was Leo who spoke first, his voice a bitter rasp through the speaker. "Are you happy now, seeing your son in a place like this?" He gestured vaguely at his surroundings. "I hope you're satisfied. This is all your fault." The words, so predictable, so childish, had no effect on Frank. The time for being wounded by his son's accusations was long past. He leaned slightly closer to the glass, his voice perfectly calm, a surgeon making a precise incision. "My fault?" he repeated, his tone devoid of emotion. "Let's be clear, Leo. I wasn't the one who lost over $200,000 at the baccarat tables at the Borgata. I wasn't the one who took money from a man named Vincent Costello and his charming little company, Blackwood Capital. And I most certainly wasn't the one who tried to sell your dead mother's jewelry to pay for it all." He watched the color drain from Leo's face. He saw the flicker of confusion turn into a wave of pure, cold panic. The mention of the casino was a blow. The mention of the name Costello was a kill shot. Leo's jaw went slack. He looked, for the first time, truly and utterly terrified. How do you know about that?" Leo stammered, his eyes wide. The last of his pathetic defenses had been shattered. He was exposed. And like a cornered animal, he immediately tried a new tactic, his voice shifting from blame to a desperate, wheedling plea. "Listen, Dad, you have to help me. You have to drop the charges. This guy, Costello, he's not someone you mess with. This isn't just about money. He'll come after you. He'll come after the house." The disguised threat, the cowardly attempt to use his own dangerous choices as a shield to manipulate his father, was the final, pathetic act. Frank held up a hand, a gesture of absolute authority that silenced his son. "Let me be the one to worry about Mr. Costello," he said, his voice dropping, taking on a hard, non-negotiable edge. You need to worry about yourself, because right now the district attorney has an open and shut case for grand larceny and forgery. But I have information that would add a motive, a clear pattern of criminal desperation that would not only guarantee a maximum sentence, but also make certain people on the inside aware of your significant outstanding debt. I imagine Mr. Costello has friends in here. Life would become very difficult for you. He let the threat hang in the sterile air between them. He saw Leo swallow hard, the raw fear in his eyes confirming everything. Frank now held all the cards. But, Frank continued, I am going to make you an offer. This is not a negotiation. These are my terms. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on his son's, a judge delivering a sentence. 1. You will instruct your lawyer to accept a plea bargain. You will plead guilty to all current charges. No trial, no fighting, no dragging your mother's name through the mud. 2. You will write a public letter of apology. It will be addressed to me, but it will be an apology for desecrating your mother's memory and for the disruption you caused in the community. It will be published in the Brooklyn paper. Our neighbors, the ones who watched you get arrested, deserve an explanation. 3. As part of your parole, you will enter a mandatory long-term residential treatment program for gambling addiction. You will complete the program. No excuses. Frank paused, letting the weight of the demand settle. If you agree to all of these terms unequivocally, then my knowledge of your debts and your association with Vincent Costello will remain between us. I will not offer it to the DA. You will do your time with the state, not with the mob. It's the only chance you're going to get, Leo. It's the only part of your father you have left. He leaned back, his part said. The choice was Leo's. It was an act of conditional justice, a sliver of mercy wrapped in a demand for total submission. It was not forgiveness. It was, Frank knew, the only way to salvage anything from the wreckage his son had made of his life. He had come not to save his son, but to dictate the terms of his surrender. The waiting was a strange, hollow purgatory. Frank had played his final card and now lived in the quiet, tense space between a threat and its outcome. For 2 days, there was only silence from the legal machinery he had set in motion. He didn't sleep much. He sat in his quiet living room, the house now scrubbed of Leo's brief, violent intrusions, and simply waited. The call came on the 3rd day. It was David Chen, his voice professionally level, but with an underlying note of grim satisfaction. Frank, I just got off the phone with Leo's counsel, David said without preamble. He's accepted all the terms. He'll plead guilty, he'll write the letter, and he'll agree to the mandatory treatment program. Frank closed his eyes. He had expected to feel a sense of triumph, a surge of righteous victory. Instead, he felt only a quiet, heavy finality, like an architect watching as a condemned building is prepared for demolition. The decision had been made. The rest was just procedure. Thank you, David, he said. Keep me informed. A week later, the letter appeared. Frank was sitting at his kitchen table with his morning coffee, scrolling through the local news on his iPad, when he saw the headline on the Brooklyn Eagle's website. An apology to a family and a community, from Leo Miller. His finger hovered over the link for a moment. He clicked. There it was, laid bare for the entire borough to see. A professional, recent headshot of Leo, smiling his confident Wall Street smile, was placed next to the block of text, a jarring contrast to the words of humiliation that followed. Frank read them slowly, each sentence a carefully constructed brick in the wall of his son's public disgrace. To the Park Slope community, and to all those who knew our family, I, Leo Miller, write these words from the Brooklyn Detention Complex to express my deepest and most sincere remorse. There are no excuses for my actions, only explanations I am now forced to confront. Blinded by greed and a secret, destructive gambling addiction, I betrayed the trust of my father, a man who has only ever shown me love and support. In my desperation, I insulted the legacy of my late mother, Sarah Miller, a woman of immense grace and integrity, by treating her memory as a commodity. I accept full responsibility for the pain and chaos I have caused. I will plead guilty to the charges against me and accept the judgment of the court. My actions should serve as a warning about the emptiness of pursuing material things at all costs and the corrosive nature of secrets. I have failed as a son and as a member of this community. I can only hope that, in time, my actions in prison and beyond will begin to atone for this unforgivable breach of trust. Frank read it a second time, then a third. It was a masterful piece of contrition, likely polished by a lawyer, but the core of the humiliation was there. It was a complete and total surrender. As he put the iPad down, his phone, which had been silent for weeks except for calls from his lawyer, began to buzz. A text message. It was from Eleanor Henderson from across the street. Frank, I just read the letter. We are all thinking of you. A brave and honorable thing for your family to do. Another message came in, then another. They were all variations on the same theme. Messages of support, of admiration for his strength. He was no longer the neighborhood spectacle. He was the vindicated patriarch. He had won back the narrative. The victory felt as hollow as the praise. The day of the sentencing was gray and overcast, the sky the color of concrete. The Kings County Supreme Court was a grand, imposing building, a place of weight and history. Frank sat in the gallery, a solitary figure in a dark suit. He was an observer now. The machinery was in motion, and he was simply there to witness the final gear click into place. Leo was led into the courtroom. He was clean-shaven and wore a borrowed suit that hung loosely on his frame. He looked like a ghost of his former self. He stood before the judge, his back to Frank, and when asked for his plea, his voice was a low, broken mumble. "Guilty, Your Honor?" The assistant district attorney made her recommendation. She noted the severity of the crimes, the premeditated nature of the fraud, the emotional cruelty of the act. But she also noted the defendant's immediate cooperation once confronted, his public admission of guilt and remorse, and his acknowledged struggle with a gambling addiction for which he was willing to seek treatment. It was a perfectly executed performance of the deal Frank had struck. The judge, a stern-faced woman with weary eyes, listened to it all, her gaze fixed on Leo. Frank watched his son's shoulders, the only part of him he could see. They were slumped in a posture of utter defeat. They did not exchange a single glance. Finally, the judge delivered the verdict. "Mr. Miller, the crimes to which you have confessed are not merely financial. They are a profound violation of familial trust at a time of immense grief. However, taking into account your plea and expressed remorse, this court sentences you to a term of 3 to 5 years in a state correctional facility. You will be eligible for parole after serving the minimum of that sentence, on the condition that you complete an accredited addiction recovery program." A gavel banged. It was over. Leo was led away. Frank remained seated for a long time as the courtroom emptied, the sound of the closing doors echoing in the vast, quiet space. He had gotten everything he wanted: justice for Sarah, punishment for Leo, vindication for himself. The law had worked, his plan had worked, and his son was going to prison. He stood up and walked out of the courthouse into the cold Brooklyn air. He had won, but as he stood alone on the steps, with the gray sky pressing down on him, he understood the true nature of his victory. He had lost his son long before he had called the police. And all this, everything he had done, hadn't won him back. It had just made the loss official. I guess 99% of you will hear this. Sigh and scroll past, not clicking. Like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you, and where are you listening? The victory, if it could be called that, was a quiet, desolate thing. After the final bang of the judge's gavel, Frank returned to a house that was no longer a sanctuary, but a museum of a life that was over. The silence had returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the hungry silence of fresh grief, but the settled, sterile quiet of an archive. Every room, every object, was an exhibit of a joy that had passed or a pain that had transpired. He was the lonely curator of a collection he no longer wished to see. For weeks he moved through the rooms like a ghost. He would stand in the doorway of the living room, the afternoon sun illuminating the dust motes, and see not the beautiful Eames chair, but the ghosts of wealthy strangers appraising his wife's jewelry. He would walk past his study and remember not the hours spent drafting blueprints, but the cold, predatory smirk on his son's face. The house was tainted. It was no longer a home. It was a crime scene. One morning he stood in the empty living room after the movers had taken the last of the furniture to storage. Sunlight streamed through the tall, bare windows, catching the faint outlines and scuff marks on the polished oak floors where their life had once stood. The room was just an architectural space, now elegant, well-proportioned, and utterly empty. It was in that stark emptiness that he found clarity. Sarah would want this, he thought, the idea arriving not as a whisper of grief, but as a clear, solid conviction. She wouldn't want our memories, our life together, to be entombed in this bitterness. She would want to turn this pain into something useful. The decision wasn't an act of forgiveness toward Leo. Frank knew with a certainty that had settled deep in his bones that some betrayals were too profound to be mended. This was for Sarah and for him. It was an act of liberation. A few days later, a call from David Chen tied off the final ugly thread. "Frank, I have some unexpected news," the lawyer said. "It seems Mr. Vincent Costello and his enterprise, Blackwood Capital, have run into some trouble of their own. A much larger FBI investigation into their other, more aggressive business practices. They're occupied. In the ensuing chaos, and given Leo's incarceration, my sources tell me Leo's debt has been written off, considered a loss. The threat is gone." Frank felt a small, detached sense of irony. The world had kept turning, and the monsters that had seemed so large in his personal drama had been consumed by bigger ones. The news didn't bring relief, just a sense of closure. The last piece of the ugly machinery had been dismantled. He met David the following week, not to discuss criminal charges, but to sign a different set of papers. They sat in David's quiet office, a thick sheaf of documents between them. The header read, "Articles of Incorporation for the Sarah Miller Foundation." Frank picked up a pen. The foundation's mission was simple and painfully specific: to provide financial and therapeutic support for the families of those suffering from gambling addiction. He was transforming the sale of the brownstone, the repository of his past, into a shield for other families' futures. He signed his name, the stroke of the pen firm and steady. Months passed. The seasons turned. The final scene of Frank's old life did not end in the grand, memory-haunted brownstone of Park Slope. It ended here, in a smaller, modern penthouse apartment in Dumbo, with floor-to-ceiling glass walls that looked out over the steel-laced arc of the Brooklyn Bridge and the glittering, indomitable skyline of Manhattan. It was a view not of the past, but of the ceaseless, forward-moving energy of the world. Frank sat at a sleek, minimalist drafting table, something he hadn't used in years. A sheet of vellum was taped to the surface, and in his hand was a charcoal pencil. He was sketching, the lines flowing from his hand with a forgotten ease. It was a plan for a small community library, a pro bono project he had decided to take on. He was building again. The afternoon light filled the apartment. On his coffee table, next to a cup of tea, was a postcard that had arrived in the mail that morning. It was a simple, store-bought card with a picture of a smiling golden retriever. The message on the back was written in a grateful, looping script. "Dear Mr. Miller, thank you. From the bottom of our hearts. The Sarah Miller Foundation helped us get our daughter into treatment and saved our family. You turned your tragedy into our hope." Frank picked up the postcard and read the words again. He looked out at the bridge, at the endless river of cars moving between the boroughs, each one a story, a life, a collection of joys and sorrows. He thought of Sarah, of her laugh, of the way she would have loved this view. He thought of Leo, a distant, sad memory, a closed chapter in a long book. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Frank Miller smiled. It wasn't the hollow smile of memory or the grim smile of victory. It was a real smile, quiet and peaceful, born not from the absence of pain, but from the discovery of a new purpose on the other side of it. He was no longer a curator of a past that hurt. He was the architect of a future he could build himself. He put the postcard down, picked up his pencil, and went back to work.